Welcome to the Embracing You podcast with your host, Eric Pothen. We are all on our own unique journey to discovering ourselves. Each episode, I will help you navigate the journey within to reconnect with and discover the innate love you have for yourself. This podcast will cover topics from self-love to eating disorders and body image to mental health and to overall well-being. My goal is to help you honor and embrace yourself so you may live your most authentic life. Let's dive in. Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Embracing You podcast. It has been quite some time since I have made an episode for you all, but here we are, middle of July, and I am ready to share this episode, wonderful episode I might add, with you all. I've been in the midst of planning an eating disorder awareness walk here in Minneapolis on behalf of NITA, so that's been taking up a majority of my time, but I'm glad to be back in this space with you all today, and be on the lookout here in the coming weeks for just a general life update from myself. I very much so am looking forward to updating you all on things that have been going on, a lot with my work in the eating disorder space, and just life in general. But today's episode is going to be about emotional eating, which I feel like is becoming a more and more popular kind of buzzword or buzzwords in the space of eating disorder recovery and disordered eating. And so I have my near and dear friend Kate with me. She was featured on a previous episode of the Embracing You podcast, and I chose to invite her back on because I truly believe that she is such a talented professional in this space. And so without further ado, let's dive in. All right. Well, good afternoon, Kate. How are you doing today?
Doing pretty well, Eric. Thanks for asking. I'm excited to be here for round 2 with you. We had such a good time the first time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things I'm most excited about with the direction I'm taking my podcast is to, of course, I love to get as many people on as possible, but kind of finding those few that I feel like I connect and resonate with a lot, and just to kind of create that container for the two of us to, continue to have conversation and build our relationship with one another. So I'm so incredibly grateful for you being willing to come back on and to share your wisdom with our audiences. But today we're going to be talking about emotional eating. And I, just before we hopped onto this call, I had said this is going to be a good one, a good conversation we're going to have today. So I guess to start our conversation off today, I want to ask the question, what is emotional eating and how does it differ from regular eating?
Great place to start. Emotional eating is essentially turning to food because of some sort of emotion that you're feeling. You're trying to regulate an emotion or navigate an emotion in the absence of physical hunger. So that's an important distinction to make, because if you are turning to food while you're feeling emotional, but you're also feeling physically hungry, then there could be components of both, right? But the true form of emotional eating is really in the absence of physical hunger, when you're turning to food as sort of a coping tool, instead of something to fill a physical need.
Yeah. So I guess the question I have for you then is, when is emotional eating okay? Because I do feel like sometimes food is meant to be, something that brings us joy and brings us, these positive emotions. So when is it okay, and when might it become a problem, quote unquote?
Yeah. So emotional eating is not inherently bad. It's not inherently wrong. Food is so much more than just physical fuel. Food is meant to provide connection and community and celebration and culture and comfort. And there are lots of different ways that we can interact with food on an emotional level in a very healthy way. It gets to be something that you might want to address when it's happening on a very frequent basis, and potentially you're eating more so for emotional needs rather than for physical needs. So if it's becoming something that you're doing on a daily basis, or it's getting to the point where you feel like you are taking in way more food than what you physically need or physically feel comfortable with, then that can definitely be an area to address with a therapist, a dietitian, a coach, etc.
Yeah, so I guess let's say you begin to notice then, that you are entering into this space of emotional eating and it's starting to maybe turn into something that you'd like to address. How do you then maybe bring that up to a therapist or a healthcare provider or anything like that? And what does working with emotional eating look like?
Yeah, so it can definitely be an uncomfortable topic to present because there's a lot of shame around emotional eating and overeating and binge eating in our society, when really a lot of people struggle with these kinds of behaviors. So, my hope in talking about it so often on my platform, and I know you talk about lots of different topics too on your platform, is to remove the shame and reduce the shame that people are feeling around these things, so that number one, they do feel more comfortable bringing it up to a healthcare provider so that they can get the support that they need. And number two, help to remove the stress that is harming them both physically and mentally when it comes to food. So, something that you could say to a healthcare provider, a coach, a dietitian, a therapist is, you can just be very honest and very vulnerable, even though it is uncomfortable, but just say, hey, this is really personal and sensitive for me to share. And I'm not really sure what the next steps would even look like. But I think that I am interacting with food in a way that's not very healthy for me. I think I am relying on food a lot for emotional reasons, and I'm turning to food a lot when I'm not even feeling physically hungry. So I really think that I need support for this, but I'm not really sure how to go about it, where to go, and I'm hoping that you can maybe give me the next step to take.
Wow, I love that. And that once again, like the way that you just said that, I noticed there was not a lot of judgment in the way that you had said it. And I think what I appreciate about, the way that you just laid that out was it was very factual and you're not adding in any of those layers of judgment. And I really feel like when we can approach these situations and approach it from curiosity and saying, here's what I've noticed, it allows yourself to remove that judgment because you're sticking to the facts and what you are noticing then in the here and now.
Absolutely. Yeah. Curiosity versus judgment is a very big topic that I talk about with clients a lot. And it sounds like you do too, since you are using that language. But it definitely is a way to remove the shame. And you're approaching it from a perspective of, I wonder why I'm doing this. I wonder why I'm interacting with food in this way versus, oh my God, I can't believe I'm doing this. I'm so bad. I can never tell anyone that this is happening.
Yeah. Why do you think people might then experience shame when we enter into this space about emotional eating? There are a couple of things that come to mind of things that might contribute to that shame, but in your opinion, what do you think are some of those other factors that contribute to that feeling?
Yeah, so first and foremost, diet culture really demonizes any interaction with food outside of how you need it for physical fuel, right? So diet culture does not allow or permit a human being to interact with food in a way that is celebratory or comforting, or anything outside of the realm of, this is the exact amount of calories you need to either maintain or lose weight, and if you go beyond that for any reason, that is wrong and inherently bad, and you should feel bad about yourself for doing that. So diet culture is a huge reason why people feel shame around food, especially when you are potentially eating quote unquote more calories than what your body might need in that moment. And it also could be associated with weight gain for some people, right? If you are eating in the absence of physical hunger, I try to normalize that with my clients a lot, but then they pose the question, well, if I'm doing that, won't I gain weight, right? If I'm taking in more calories than I need, if I'm eating when I'm not actually physically hungry, isn't that bad for me? Doesn't that mean I'll gain weight? Doesn't that mean that I'm unhealthy? And my answer is always no, because weight is a very complex science, And just because you are quote unquote overeating for one meal during that day, or you're eating in the absence of physical hunger from time to time for an emotional reason, that doesn't mean that you're automatically going to gain weight in those 24 hours. The body is much more complex than that, and it takes a lot more to shift you outside of your set point weight range than interacting with food occasionally for emotional reasons.
Yeah, that was a beautiful explanation. And, I just am thinking back to my own lived experience. And in those moments where I felt like I overate, it's amazing how quickly the mind can jump to saying you're going to gain 10 pounds because you overate in that one meal. And I love that you had mentioned like that's not the reality. And that's not your body won't, you're not going to gain 10 pounds from one meal. So it's really learning once again, and I think this is integral when we're entering into this space of emotional eating, is just that awareness and the ability to zoom out and to fact check. Um, because so often these disordered eating or diet culture thoughts are going to enter into our mind, and we haven't truly taken the time to pause and kind of question and challenge those thoughts because they've become so deeply ingrained and reinforced within our own minds. So I love that you hold up a mirror in a way too of when we kind of enter into that space and experiencing some of the shame, post maybe overeating in an emotional way. Um, and so I guess, now that I ended with that, let's say an individual engages in emotional eating. What are some common things outside of shame that they might feel? And what are some ways that these individuals can learn to address and work with some of these emotions that they may feel post an emotional eating episode?
Yeah. So some people, emotional eating can happen for a variety of different reasons, right? It can happen for negative emotions and it can happen for positive emotions too. So I would say, if you are engaging with food to regulate negative emotions, right, then you might feel some sense of guilt, shame, regret. You might feel some sense of relief. You might feel a sense of numbness. So there's a lot of different outcomes that are possible. And some of those things that I mentioned, like relief and numbing, are actually what might keep you coming back to that emotional eating. Because if you are trying to distract yourself from negative emotions, if you are trying to comfort yourself during negative emotions and you feel some sense of relief, you feel some sense of comfort, you feel some sense of numbing, then that is reinforcing to your brain, okay, this is working, right? So using that food in that way, it can become, you can rely on food. It's very predictable, it's very accessible, and can become, a very, deeply ingrained habit that you keep turning to food to regulate these negative emotions. If what you're experiencing after you emotionally eat is continued negative emotions like guilt or shame or regret, embarrassment, judgment, self criticism, then some ways I would suggest that you deal with those are number one, through reframing, right? Allowing yourself to take those negative thoughts, those negative feelings, and at least try to bring them to a place of neutrality, approaching with curiosity, as we've just mentioned, right? So instead of looking at that emotional eating experience as something to be, criticized or picked apart or judged, it's more a learning experience. Oh, I'm learning more about myself here. I used food right after I felt, lonely, or right after I felt stressed, or right after I felt sad. And I turned to food. So you're understanding your triggers, you're understanding why you might be reaching for food. So, reframing and saying, okay, I'm learning more about myself here. It wasn't a pleasant experience. I don't actually feel better after that emotional eating experience. So, I'm going to reframe this as a learning opportunity for me, and allow myself to recognize that food is reliable, food is accessible, and it is a coping tool that I've learned to rely on. So, I can't change my habits overnight. I can't, remove this behavior overnight completely. So I'm working on it. I always tell my clients to remember that simple, simple line of, I'm working on it, because it can get really easy to fall into these, kind of spirals of, oh, I can't figure it out. I keep doing the same thing. I can't get out of this cycle. But it's really important to approach with compassion and curiosity and really a sense of gentleness, so that you can uh, remain grounded and remain calm and try to figure out what's actually going on here. So that was a long-winded way of saying, like, be kind to yourself in those moments. Essentially, be kind, be compassionate, and allow yourself to recognize it as a learning opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that last statement that you had mentioned too, of just the simple notion of saying to yourself, I'm working on it. Um, I'm a teacher by trade. And so something that's big in the education world is growth mindset, right? Where if you believe that, you know, you can do it, and not limiting yourself, because the words that you say to yourself can create your reality. And so, even that simple notion of I'm working on it, that, you know, deep within that, it says you're working towards something still. You're not at a standpoint. You are putting in the work and it's getting you somewhere. And you're not going backwards. You could go backwards, but you can only move forwards from there. And so I just love that simple statement of I'm working on it. Or another one that I like to use is I'm not there yet. The power of yet, I think, is so powerful, because it once again it adds meaning of you're going to get there, right? I'm not there yet. And just kind of embracing that journey, I think, is so incredibly important. And I like the other point that you touched on too, when you were talking about, after you've noticed it happening, approaching it from curiosity and taking it as a learning opportunity, and trying to kind of reflect back and think, what need was this meeting in the moment? Right? I think so often when, individuals turn to food, right, especially in the space of emotional eating, it's meeting some sort of need. And I think when we can kind of like become curious, I feel like this is the word of our conversation today. Um, but if you can become a little bit more curious about, what was the situation? What was I experiencing that led me to this moment to want to turn to food? You take that as knowledge to carry with you into the next time you might find yourself into that space, which I think is so important.
Absolutely. Yeah. Having a little bit of detective energy in you is always really helpful, because then you're able to be an observer, right? Kind of an unbiased observer, and start to recognize patterns, right? Hey, every time this one thing happens at work, I get home and feel really stressed and overwhelmed. And that's when I find myself emotionally eating. Or every time I wear those one pair of pants that makes me feel really bad about myself, as soon as I get home and take them off, that's when I'm reaching for food, even after I just came home from dinner and I'm not feeling physically hungry, right? So you're able to identify these patterns. And then next time you're in a situation like that, you can almost anticipate that it might happen. So, number one, you can allow it to happen, right? Because we're not trying to demonize emotional eating. Sometimes food is really helpful, but you can anticipate and say, okay, what are some other things that I could possibly do to help me regulate my emotions in that moment? Because I know that turning to food every single time this happens is not very sustainable for me. It's not very helpful for me. And it's not actually helping me get to the root of the problem. It's more so a band aid. In the moment, it makes me feel a little bit better. And then I end up feeling worse. And then it's this endless cycle of feeling better than worse than better than worse. And I'm not actually healing the wound that's underneath causing it to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one thing that's coming to my own mind is that, for someone who has been in recovery for a decent amount of time, and kind of talking about this emotional awareness, that that comes a little bit easier to me, because I've really grown in that kind of introspective, pausing, zooming out. That's been key in my own personal recovery. But these can be difficult skills for someone who might be entering into this space and learning to first sift through emotions, identifying needs. Like, I want listeners to know that when we are talking about what you can do to address emotional eating, like, this is challenging work. And I think this is where, you hit the nail on the head with, it is more than okay. And you should feel safe enough to bring this up to, especially if you are seeing a therapist, you are seeing a dietitian or any other medical healthcare professional, because you need to be guided in this space, especially if you feel uncertain and you aren't confident enough in your skills and ability to maneuver and navigate these very complex emotions that are so situational. And once again, you get the messaging from diet culture. And can you differentiate diet culture thoughts from your own individual thoughts? And so this is a big topic and concept that we're talking about that requires a lot of fine tuning skills.
Yes, absolutely. I am always using emotion wheels with my clients to help them pinpoint more specific emotions that they might be feeling, because they might come into session or come into the work with a therapist or a dietitian for the first time, or maybe the first time in a long time, and they might not have the self-awareness to understand the nuance of emotions. And really they understand, like, if they're feeling something positive or something negative, but they're not sure how to get to that next level of, I'm feeling self-critical, or I'm feeling excited, or I'm feeling remorse, like whatever it might be, that's a little bit more specific. It can be so helpful and so illuminating in the process of recovery. So I think that's really important to bring up. And again, for the listeners, like, if you're not there yet, it is absolutely okay.
Yeah, and I think I love that you use an emotional wheel, because I use that too myself, just like as an individual, right? And I think we're all humans, and I feel like we've gotten to this point within society where we kind of resort to using like anxious, happy, sad, just like these big generic terms. But that's what I love about this emotion wheel, is that, it just keeps getting deeper and deeper and with more specificity. And I think, if you can truly identify your emotion, then you can work with it and address it. I love this concept of name it to tame it. And that is like right on with what you're saying too, is like, if you can accurately name what it is that you're experiencing, you're going to be able to tame it. You're going to be able to work with it. But if you don't have that specificity, it's hard to know how to work with it because you don't actually know what you're feeling.
100%. I completely agree with that. And also, I know your listener population is mostly people who are in recovery from eating disorders, or struggling from an eating disorder. So I do want to say, I think it's important to note that if you are in a medically compromised place currently, it might be near impossible for you to have these conversations, these higher level conversations of, what am I feeling and what emotion is this, because your brain is undernourished. So I want to make that clear, that this might be kind of like step 2 in the recovery journey for you. And if you just have to focus on eating your meal plan and nourishing your body and your brain in this moment, and then the next level is getting to these more complex topics, because then your brain can handle it and comprehend it more, that is absolutely okay too. So I don't want you to feel like you need to rush the recovery process because you're not having these conversations yet. If you need to focus on getting to a place of medical stability first, that is what you need to do. And I want to make that clear as well.
Yeah, I love that. And thank you for bringing that point up too. And, it kind of just reminds me of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs for some reason, of just like, at the base of the pyramid is, food and shelter and just like the basic needs. And I think you hit the nail on the head, is once we can just meet those basic needs, it's going to allow us to continue to move up that hierarchy of needs. Um, and that is so true, right? Where once again, we've identified that these are pretty, that doing the work, quote unquote, in this space requires those higher levels of thinking and greater emotional awareness. And if you aren't nourishing your body and your brain enough to, give yourself that mental and emotional capacity to enter into that space, this work is going to be pretty challenging for anyone to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, on that same kind of like thought pattern, you might think in this moment that you're turning to food for emotional reasons, when really it's just your body asking for more food from a physical need. If you are out of touch with your hunger and fullness cues, you might think that you're eating when you're not hungry, but really it could be your body asking for more food because you're not nourishing it well enough. So that's why it's so important when you're working with, a therapist, dietitian, coach, to make sure that you are in a stable place of nourishment before you're having these conversations, because you might assume like, oh, I feel like I'm overeating, or oh, I feel like I'm emotionally eating because I don't feel hungry when I'm eating, or I'm eating past the point of comfortable fullness. But if that is part of your meal plan, if that is part of your plan for refeeding and renourishment, then it's not emotional eating and it's not overeating. You are literally just renourishing your body in an appropriate way so that you are safe and stable. So once you, again, kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, once that is taken care of, once your physical needs are taken care of, then we can get to those more nuanced conversations of, okay, like, is there any emotional eating going on, or are you eating past the point of comfortable fullness now once you are reconnected with your body in that way?
Mhm. Yeah, and you know, what you just said right there made me think about something that's really important, I think, for us to talk about as we're, talking about emotional eating too is, are you able to identify your own hunger cues? Right? Because I feel like a lot of people that are, maybe living with an eating disorder and entering into the early stages of recovery, it's really, I mean, at least from my own personal experience, it was really hard for me to identify and even feel hunger cues because I had just numbed and completely pushed that out of my brain. And so, there were moments where I just felt like I was eating because I knew I needed to eat. And but it takes training. It takes training and it takes a lot of time sitting with self and paying attention to a lot of these physiological cues that our body is giving us and not resorting to those other behaviors and habits that, whenever we would feel those and when we were living with our eating disorder, that we would just cope with those and ignore. But I think that it sounds like it's so crucial, right, when we're talking about emotional eating and being able to differentiate between emotional eating versus maybe, I don't like to use the word regular, but just everyday eating, right? Um, just how key it is to be able to notice those physiological cues and hunger cues within the body.
Totally. Yeah. That's why it is so important to get to a stable place where you are eating a bit more intuitively and you know that you're nourishing yourself appropriately, and your dietitian checks off and is like, "Yep, like this looks like a good amount of food for you," and you're experiencing, an average amount of hunger and fullness cues, and it feels easier to eat and you do feel more connected. Again, that's when you can get to the point of having those more nuanced conversations of, okay, let's like get in there and fine tune a little bit now, right? Like once we have the basics down, now we can like really get to the more detailed conversations of, what are your new coping tools that you're turning to. And since we've, you know, hopefully eliminated all of the eating disorder behaviors that used to be coping tools, what are we replacing those with? What are some healthier coping tools that we can utilize when we're talking about something like emotional eating, so that you have a toolbox and you have, those go-tos that will help you, because you don't want to turn to your eating disorder anymore.
hmm So I think this is the perfect time to ask you. We've done a lot of conversation and conversing around, okay, we were identifying here that when we are engaging in emotional eating, it's, meeting some sort of need, and we know we should not engage in the emotional eating because now we have this awareness. But what are some things, I guess, if, individuals out there that are listening are struggling with emotional eating, what are some other coping strategies or other tools that some of these people can use should they find themselves in need of a redirection from engaging in emotional eating?
Yeah, great question. This is super individualized because not everyone responds to the same coping tools in the same way, right? So it takes a lot of experimentation, a lot of trial and error, and it's really important to keep a list somewhere. I always say write it down, whether it's in the notes app in your phone or you're keeping a physical list. When you do try a new coping tool, and you should try it more than once, right? When you do try a new coping tool and it works, write it down, put it into that toolbox. so that, when you are struggling with a really strong emotion next time, and maybe you like forget what used to work, or maybe you forget what you can even do instead of eating, you have a physical list to turn to. So, some of the things that can be on that list are calling a friend or someone you feel close with, and sharing what's on your mind, offloading some of those emotions, journaling and getting those emotions out onto paper, doing some sort of movement, going for a walk, or doing some stretching, doing some gentle yoga to help regulate or ground. Getting out in nature is a beautiful way to regulate emotions and get yourself out of your mind. And yeah, so getting out in nature is a huge one that I always recommend. Doing some sort of just like basic self-care. I think when we talk about self-care now, I think it's so glamorized. Like everyone kind of jumps to like, oh, I should book a massage, or I need to go get my nails done, or something that costs a lot of money. But I think self-care can also be really simple, right? So maybe it's putting on a $2 face mask from the drugstore, or, maybe it's taking a bubble bath, or, something along those lines, where it can be just in your home and really accessible. It doesn't have to take a lot of time or money. And I think self care should be accessible to everyone. So, something that is pretty simple. You can also consider, obviously, meditation and breath work. That's my number one go to. I can't believe I didn't even say that yet. But meditation and breath work, I think, is so, so instrumental in grounding and self regulating. And every single client I've ever worked with will probably tell you that I talk about meditation and breath work almost in every single session. Because I do think it's so important. And once you get the swing of it, once you really get into it, it can be so impactful and so influential in the way that you handle and regulate emotions. So, having that as a practice on a daily basis, not even when you're in the moment of turning to food for some sort of emotion, um, it should be a practice on a daily basis. So, that's a huge one that I want to mention too. And then, lastly, I will say, to use these coping tools, kind of like put them into practice, there's this technique or strategy that I typically suggest called the 3 Ps: pause, process, postpone. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of it before, but it kind of allows a natural pause before you turn to food. So when you're noticing, like, oh, I'm really feeling stressed here, or I'm feeling overwhelmed here, or I'm feeling, really lonely here, and I think food will really solve this thing for me, right? All I want you to do is pause, take a breath, take a beat. Don't immediately act on that urge or that instinct, because this is how you disrupt those instincts, right? By creating a little bit of space. So we're going to pause. Secondly, we're going to process. We are going to ask ourselves, what do I actually need in this moment, right? Like, I'm feeling stressed, I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'm feeling lonely. What do I actually need? Do I need to do some breath work? Do I need to go for a walk? Do I need to call a friend? What would actually help me to feel better in the long term, rather than just turning to food as one of those band-aids, right? And then you're going to postpone. You're going to do one of those coping tools for like 10, 15 minutes and see if it works, right? That's how you experiment. That's how you get this collection of tools that you can turn to by experimenting in those moments. So just 10 to 15 minutes. And if at the end of those 10 to 15 minutes, you're like, no, I still really want food. This isn't working. I think all I really want is a bowl of ice cream right now and to sit in front of the TV and just numb. Okay, fine, do that, right? We don't want to demonize emotional eating. It can absolutely be one of the tools in your toolbox. We just don't want it to be the only tool in your toolbox.
Yeah, I feel like I really resonate with the 3 Ps. Um, and I think even outside of the space of food, this is something I've worked with individually with my own mental health therapist, right? Like, so I think this concept is so applicable to all areas of life, especially when we're talking about emotions, because so often whenever we experience that first sense of discomfort, what do? We impulsively respond to eliminate that uncomfortable emotion right away, because we're taught discomfort equals bad in our society. And so I really think that there is such a need for us to shift the language when it comes to using the word discomfort, because discomfort is actually one of the biggest learning tools for us to help us grow as individuals. And so I love this, that you reinforce this concept of, the three P's, because when you can allow yourself to pause and not impulsively respond in the previous ways that you have, that's when all of the wiring in the brain starts to change. And that's when those new neural pathways get built and really start moving you in that direction of developing those other coping strategies and beginning to experiment with what works well. And maybe that strategy didn't work for me. That's okay. Right. And I think removing any sort of judgment if you tried something new and it didn't work as well, and not letting that influence or affect the way that you move forward if you find yourself in another instance like that. And so once again, I just love that you mentioned the three P's. Right, there's so much power in the pause, and I feel like I talk about that so much with not even clients that I work with, but just like friends in life. Like, I love talking about mental health. And so when the people say, like, what's one of the biggest things you learned in therapy, it's that.
Yeah, I think you learn so much about yourself in those pauses, and so much about your emotions, so much about how to meet your own needs. And it really can be uncomfortable in the beginning, because if you're not used to sitting in those emotions, you're not used to asking yourself, what do I need here? And really, you're just turning to an eating disorder behavior, or you're turning to some sort of maladaptive coping tool. It really can be uncomfortable to sit there and ask yourself, what's going on here, right? And getting to the bottom of it and being that detective that I mentioned earlier. Sometimes you're scared of what you might find, or you're a little bit nervous or hesitant or confused. If I do find XYZ, what do I even do about that, right? And those are the really important conversations to be having in therapy with your dietitian, to get support with, so that you don't feel so alone in navigating these new and really uncomfortable waters.
And that it's okay to ask for help, right? I think, that was one of the hardest things for me looking back at my own recovery journey, is that I never formally asked for help in my own recovery. And I always wonder, and once again, I whenever I reflect, I try to not allow judgment into the picture, but I wonder what life would look like for me now had I had the courage to ask for that help I knew I needed. And so I just really want to reiterate for listeners that asking for help is never a sign of weakness, and it's actually a sign of strength. That's showing you have courage. It's showing you have grit, you have resiliency, that you want yourself to be well. And so this is something as a society I think we need, and I think we're moving in that direction, and we're really starting to shift the verbiage around asking for help, but recognizing that that's also okay.
Yeah, I really hope we are moving in that direction. And, I hope these conversations help that movement. And I think it's really important to be talking about asking for help and allowing that to be okay, because talking about shame and judgment, those also play a role in preventing someone in asking for help, when really their recovery process could be sped up so much, if they do have a support team. Because I was similar to you. I didn't ask for formal help until I was probably in like the last 25% of my recovery journey, in hindsight. And it probably would have not taken as long to get to the place where I am now if I had had that support system earlier on in my recovery journey. So there is absolutely nothing wrong with asking for help. And I think that health and wellness are huge topics in society today. And people put so much pressure on themselves to figure it out alone, and to figure out how to be well and to be healthy by piecing together random bits of information from the internet, and seeing other people who have quote unquote cured their gut health and all of these different things. And so it's a lot of pressure on the individual to figure it out for themselves. But your individual health and well-being, it can be discovered through the support of a team, and through the support of experts who know what they're talking about and know how to guide you to a place of well-being that is sustainable and that feels authentic for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love to, like, health and wellness is holistic. It should be used as a holistic term, not just, your physical health, right? Like there's so much more to wellness to that. And I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but, I love that, when you work with a professional, I would like to hope that the professional that you work with, especially in the space of, you know, eating disorder dietitians and eating disorder recovery coaches, that they approach their work through a lens of holistic and being holistic, because there's so much healing to be done in all areas of self when you enter into the space of recovery. There's a lot going on mentally, there's a lot physically, emotionally, spiritually. Like there are just so many different things that individuals are working with. And so I love that you talked about too. It's like we need to approach this through a more holistic lens as well. Um, in my mind is, as we're kind of talking about this concept of emotional eating, I had a recent conversation with another guest about binge eating. And so my mind goes to, I know there's kind of a lot of gray area kind of in the space of eating disorders and, what classifies what as what at times, but how does emotional eating, in your opinion, differ from a binge eating episode?
Sure, great question. Emotional eating is not as well defined as binge eating, I would say. In order to meet the criteria for binge eating in the DSM, it has to meet, I think I forget what number of points there are, but it has to be a large, it's also kind of gray too, though, the definition, because it's basically defined as quote unquote eating a larger amount of food than what is considered to be average or normal within a certain period of time, followed by feelings of shame and guilt and judgment. That's just my language. That's not the actual definition from the DSM, but that's basically what it is. And emotional eating, if you think about it, like could also kind of be defined that way. But binge eating, there is a certain number of times it needs to be happening per week or per month. And then emotional eating really doesn't have that same definition. So it's more of a personal experience. And this is where lived experience really comes into play, and listening to our clients and hearing them and believing them with what they're experiencing. Because if they're saying, like, hey, I feel like I am relying on food way too heavily for emotions multiple times per week, then yeah, maybe it could be defined as binge eating depending on how much food they're eating and what period of time they're eating it within. But those experiences can feel really similar. And I don't think it necessarily has to have a label for whatever they are experiencing. And I don't want anyone to like fall into that headspace of, I need to have a label in order to get help. I'm just emotionally eating. It's not quote unquote that bad. But whatever you're experiencing, if it's uncomfortable, unpleasant, it's weighing on you, you deserve support. And I think the verbiage doesn't matter so much as long as, you are, being honest with yourself and saying, like, this doesn't feel right to me. So I'm going to get help for this thing.
Mm. Yeah, and I love that too of, you know, everyone's experience is so unique, and no one's experience, whatever they are experiencing makes their experience more or less valid than another individual's. And I think what you had just said there sums that up so beautifully, right? Where, you know, who cares about the label? You need help, and that's okay. Like it's okay to not necessarily be able to name it, right? Even though we had talked about the name it to tame it, and but I think when we're first talking about the reaching out and getting help, it's okay to not necessarily know, as long as you're able to describe and just fully be in your body and really just become curious once again. I think that makes all the difference, and I think that's so important to name when we enter into this space, because sometimes I feel like so often in the space of eating disorders, like you often hear the phrase of like, oh, I'm not sick enough to get a diagnosis, or I'm not sick enough to receive treatment. And so people never reach out for help because, they compare themselves to another individual. Well, they're sicker than me, so I don't deserve help.
Absolutely. I hear that at least once a week from one of my clients or multiple of my clients that, I don't even know if I need to be here. I don't feel sick enough. I feel fine, right? But when we look at behaviors and we look at mental health and everything else going on, the larger picture, that holistic picture, they really aren't well and they are not healthy. So it really doesn't matter what kind of uh, extreme you're feeling, or that maybe that's not the right word. It doesn't really matter the level of distress, whether it's more minimal or more extreme. If there is any level of distress or stress or guilt or shame or overwhelm around food, you absolutely are deserving of help, or you absolutely are deserving of help. So I think that's really important and a good conversation to have.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before we end our time here together, Kate, if you could give any other words of encouragement or advice to, maybe some individuals who are struggling with emotional eating. And once again, I want to maybe remove the word struggling from that, right? As that's kind of maybe a judgment word, but maybe navigating and experiencing emotional eating. What would be some words of encouragement or advice you would want to give them?
Number one, reach out for help. Because we have talked about that multiple times through this episode. Number one, you are deserving of help, so get it. Number two, uh, get to know yourself, right? Get to know yourself a little bit better, get to know your emotions and how you deal with emotions, get to know the coping tools that you can start to rely on a little bit more in those emotional situations, and allow yourself to be imperfect in this process. Allow yourself to move through it in a way that is not, perfect and, incrementally increasing and you're getting better every single day. There's going to be days where it feels harder. So allow yourself to heal, imperfectly. One of my best friends, and she's also a dietitian in this space, said that the other day, and it really stuck with me. Allow yourself to heal imperfectly, because there is no such thing as a perfect recovery journey. So if you are trying to navigate these waters of emotional eating and you're feeling, overwhelmed or lost, just keep going. Just keep going and remind yourself that you are working on it, right? And you're not there yet.
Yeah, I love those final words of encouragement there. I think they're so approachable, and I think they will land really softly with listeners today. But if individuals that are listening are curious to find you and learn more about the work that you do, where can they find you? I know that you're on social media, you have a website, you do some coaching, group coaching as well. So just share a little bit about that for listeners.
Yeah, so our practice is called Wholesome Chick Nutrition. We are a group private practice that helps clients globally, all virtual. So no matter where you live, we can support you in one way or another. We have both one on one coaching and we also have group coaching as well as self paced courses. So you can find all of that information on our website, www.wholesomechicknutrition.com. And then that is also my handle for both TikTok and Instagram, Wholesome Chick Nutrition.
Awesome. Well, I'll be sure to include that in the show notes for listeners so they're able to find you. And for listeners that don't know Kate or don't follow Kate on social media, be sure to check out her BuzzFeed article, one of her videos that she had posted. The messaging behind it is so needed in this space of anti-diet culture. And I just really encourage you to take a look at that article, as I think you are doing such beautiful work in this space, Kate, and your voice in the work is so needed. And so I just want to celebrate you and all that you do and bring into this space to make it more welcoming and inclusive. So there's just so much gratitude for you and your time that you were giving us today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And, same to you. You are doing such incredible and important work. And I think every single thing you share on your platform is very much needed and inspiring and insightful. So, really, it was a pleasure to chat with you again today. And I hope everyone listening enjoyed the episode.
Awesome. Thanks again, Kate. Once again, I would like to give a big thank you to Kate for her time and her words of wisdom that she was able to share with us on the podcast today. Once again, if you are interested in learning more about Kate and the work that she does, all of the information that she shared about where to find her can be found in today's show notes. But I want to thank you all for tuning in to another episode of the Embracing You podcast. I really value the time that we are able to share with one another as we step into this space. So until next time, I hope that you all continue to show yourself some love. You remind yourself of your innate worth. And most importantly, you take the time for yourself to nourish both your mind and your body. Much love.